Welcome to A Drop of Silence, the groundbreaking podcast series that dives deep into the realms of controversy. Join us as we bring special guests who share their extraordinary experiences and offer unparalleled insight into history, today's news headlines, and the future. Get ready to embark on a thought-provoking journey where silence speaks volumes and the truth lies somewhere beneath the surface.
What time will it be when war is no more? When bullets are melted and the warships moor.
Shalom. My next guest is an amazing, wonderful lady. Her name is Merle Saferstein. I met her at a conference online, and we were talking about Holocaust survivors, and we were listening to a Holocaust survivor tell about her series. And Merle and I got talking afterwards, and she explained to me how she never could make friends very much during her life. And she spent a lot of time writing in journals, like in the stenographer's pads and everything. But once she learned about the Holocaust and she started meeting these people as she got older and developed her line of work, she realized that all those years of writing in journals gave her this immense, wonderful capability of helping these people write their own stories in journals and to be able to look at things from a different perspective. And she not only did that, she went on and pursued this for cancer patients and then for children that have disabilities and other problems. And she ends up being one of the most amazing women I think I've ever met in my life. She's written 2 books about her journals and how she used them to get herself through life and to face all of the hardships that she knew about. And I thought it would be interesting for you to hear what she had to say. Welcome, everybody, to the podcast series, A Drop of Silence. I'm Pam Goldstein, your host for this series. And today I have a wonderful guest I absolutely adore. Her name is Merle Saferstein. As the Director of Educational Outreach at the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center for 26 years, which is longer than my nursing career, Merle Saferstein worked closely with hundreds of Holocaust survivors, helping them pass along their legacy of remembrance to hundreds of thousands of students and teachers. That's no small achievement. When she retired from the Holocaust Center, she developed a course entitled Living and Leaving Your Legacy and teaches and speaks to audiences locally, nationally, and internationally. She trains hospice staff and volunteers, showing them ways to help patients leave their legacies, and works closely with the patients at the end of their lives, doing sacred legacy work. For many years, she has volunteered at a camp for children who experience the death of a family member, helping them gain important tools, including journaling to cope with their grief. Merle has taken excerpts from her many personal journals and created Living and Leaving My Legacy Volumes 1 and 2, which I recommend. I've read both Amazon bestsellers. She is also the author of the award-winning Room 732. Merle is a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post, Medium, Authority Magazine, Women Writers, Women's Books, and Thrive Global, and has been featured on NPR and MSN.com. Welcome, Merle, to the podcast series.
Thank you, Pam. I'm so happy to be talking to you today.
Of course, I have a gazillion billion questions.
My first question is, you talk about having written something like 379 journals. How did you get started? Was there an event that caused you to start writing those journals?
It started in 1974 when I was about to turn 30. We had moved to Florida a few years before that. And basically, I had two very small children. My son was born in 73 and my daughter in 71, the end of 71. And so I was pretty much stuck at home. I was somewhat alone in that I had not made many friends at that point. And one day I just picked up an old stenographer's pad that I had been keeping dreams in for a dream log for a course I had taken, and started writing. And so for I'd say the first 7 years or so, I would write periodically. As a teenager, I had written, and I liked to write. Writing was something I always enjoyed doing. And then in 82, I started to seriously journal. And at that point, I was journaling on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a day, and have continued to do so.
Yeah, it's really interesting because as a psychiatric nurse, one of the first things I used to do when I had teenagers, especially, the doctor would say, well, why did you do this? Why did you try to kill yourself? And I would say, give me 5 pages worth on why you thought this was a necessary thing. And it's picked up, and I'm not sure if it was part of your programming or however it came about. But there is a judge, Leora Krieger, in California, who does the same thing when the teenagers come before, as adolescents, and she'll say, well, why did you do this? Well, I don't know, that because they always say that. And she would say, give me 10 pages. You're in jail until you give me 10 pages on why you did this. And she has a huge success rate. So I like the way you took your journaling and brought it to the Holocaust survivors, and teaching people how to do that. How did you become involved with the Holocaust survivors?
A long story.
Oh, we got time. I got a cup of tea.
So in 82, I was about to quit a job I had, and I started going to the beach. It was winter vacation, and saw a man who was basically jogging along the shore the same way I was in the morning. And then he was set up just a few feet away from me with his books and writing the same way I did. We kept looking at each other, and one day he stopped to talk, and he had been a former priest. And I was basically going through an existential crisis, trying to figure out who I was and where I was going next. And he had the spiritual pieces that I really needed. And he had done a lot of studying of Carl Jung. And so he introduced me to that world. And we started talking. He left Florida shortly after that and moved to Washington, D.C. and then New York. And I'll shorten it by just saying that he was doing temp work and ended up doing a play, promoting a play called Yours, Anne, which was about the Diary of Anne Frank, but it was an operetta on off-Broadway. And the producer of the play was the president of the Anne Frank Center in New York. He asked my friend Tom to come and to be the executive director. At the same time, someone had found the Anne Frank family photo album in a chest of drawers and in Germany, and sent it to the Anne Frank Center, where they then created this 800 piece photographs of Anne Frank in her life, but it's really the world surrounding the Holocaust surrounding it. So it was called Anne Frank in the World, 1929 to 1945. So this was in the beginning of 1985. And I was still not working. I had quit and was just kind of lost, actually. And Tom called me and said, is this something you'd like to bring to Miami as a pilot city? I know that Anne Frank speaks to your soul. I know you're a journal writer. It just feels like this would be perfect. And at that point, I really needed to be working. But at the same time, my husband agreed that this was something I had to do. So I did it as a volunteer. I brought the exhibit to Miami. My goal was to have 50,000 people see the exhibit in 6 weeks. We ended up having well over 60,000, and I got an editorial in Miami Herald. So those were my two goals. During that time, I did a lot of student programming and had two of the women from the Holocaust Center in Miami come to to one of the programs and speak to the students. And so afterwards, they called me to come and volunteer because they needed someone to help them do student programming. They were doing adult programming, but not student programming. So I went as a volunteer 2 weeks after the secretary quit, and they asked me if I would be the secretary. And I said, I'll do that, but only for 3 months. And then if I'm not in education, I really need to be out of here. So at the same time, they had just hired someone from California who got her PhD in Holocaust studies to come be the director of the Department of Education. Well, she came, and she ended up to be a disaster. And at some point, a few months later, my boss kept giving me all the administrative work. And finally, they fired her. And the president of our center at the time was president of one of the universities, took me to breakfast, grilled me for 3 hours, and said, you can do this. And so that's how I began. And that was in March of 86.
Wow. And you did that for 26 years.
And it was all because I met this man who had just been a Catholic priest. My mother, who was a Hebrew school teacher, was only afraid that he was trying to convert me. And meanwhile, it led me to the most important career that I could have ever had. Important and meaningful.
So, work, like when I worked with Holocaust survivors, you and I have talked about this, they affected me in such a profound way, ways that I never imagined they would affect me. And even when I think about it now, it blows my mind. How did they affect you? How did working with Holocaust survivors affect you?
Probably the greatest thing that I learned from working with Holocaust survivors was the resilience of the human spirit. So that to me was huge and has really taught me a lot about how to live my life as a result. I think I'm very fortunate in that I can hear people's stories, and they can be really tragic. And while I take them in without question, I don't absorb them the way some people do. And so I felt that was a gift, that I was able to work with the survivors and talk to them and listen to their stories, and of course be devastated to some extent. But really, they taught me so much about life and about moving forward, picking up the pieces, going on and living a life that is full and rich. Another thing that happened, we did a lot of programming where we had students sitting at tables with Holocaust survivors. And one of the things that always amazed me is that sometimes the conversation would get really heavy and emotional, and some of the kids would have to leave the table and go out to the restroom. And I knew that I could always go to one of the survivors and say, can you go talk to so-and-so? Their strength of character was so amazing that they could go in and calm these students down, where you'd think it would be the other way around. You'd think the survivors would be the one crying and the students would not. But I watched relationships develop within a day's program, where these kids would sit with someone who seemed like an old man or woman when they sat down, and they came to understand that these survivors went through what they went through because of prejudice. And then we would also talk about what is the prejudice going on in your life. And so it created bonds that were just really incredible.
Wow, that's unbelievable. And tell me about this camp that you worked at of children who suffered from a death in their family.
When I retired from the Holocaust Center, I knew that I wanted to volunteer. And I had previously, throughout the years, had volunteered with a hospice organization. And when I quit my job, when I retired, I knew that one of the things I wanted to do was to work with volunteering in some way. And I decided to go back to the hospice organization. It was actually a different one. And they were just starting a camp for children who were grieving. And I had years before that, in the late 70s and early 80s, run a day camp with 350 kids. And so I said, well, I can certainly help you do that. So I helped them plan the camp. And then we did this camp for, we do it once a year for children. So it's a weekend, basically a weekend retreat for them. And what we do is we have the children talk about their loss. We don't pussyfoot around. And these are kids ages, youngest 4, which is really young, and we try not to have them that young, but sometimes if their siblings are coming, they do too, to 18 years old. And we divide them in groups. One of the things that I do is journaling with each of the different age groups. And then one day I now do the parent session. So I meet with the parents of these children after I've already been with all their kids. And I'm able to talk to the parents about what we've done with their children. So many parents want to protect their children and not talk about the death and whatever. And to me, it's so important to be able to discuss that. And so the parents are surprised that we've actually had their kids talk about who died and whatever. And also I understand that the parents are suffering a double loss because they're dealing with their own loss, but they also have to deal with their children's loss. And so we give them tools. And that's really what this camp is all about. We help to normalize death, to make these kids understand that they're not the only ones that are going through this, and to help the parents understand. And so the conversations between the parents are often so powerful.
Yeah, I remember when I worked the cancer unit, and people always tried to keep it a secret from the kids that their parents were dying or whatever. But those kids knew. Like everyone I talked to, they knew exactly what was going on, and they couldn't understand why the adults wouldn't talk to them about it. Did you find that as well?
So no, I didn't find that. But what I had a friend who was an oncologist, and he told me that he worked with children, and he said he would go into the room and the parents would say, our kid does not know he's dying, or he has cancer, don't tell him. And the doctor would say, well, if you aren't going to tell them, then the person in the bed next to him will, or I will. So you have your choice, but they have to know.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's such a disservice. One of the exercises I do with the parents, the very first exercise I do, is I have them close their eyes and think about the first death that they experienced in their life. And then I had them think about what was the reaction of the people around them. Did they have support? Were they told to just go off and go play and ignored their feelings being ignored? And that's really powerful because that helps them to understand what worked for them or didn't work for them so that they can do differently to their children.
Yeah.
I have a friend who says to me, she's a psychologist, and she always says, people come into my office and never complain if someone made them go to a funeral as a child, but they do always have something to say if they weren't allowed to go.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think about Kubler-Ross? Do you believe in any of what she does? Because for me, journalism, like having people write in their journals, I always get the feeling they gain more insight than what they do with somebody like Kubler-Ross.
Well, I think she served a really important purpose, and I think when she listed the stages of dying, it was not for the people who were left as the survivors of that, but really the people that were going through the death process to be angry, to accept, to be in denial. Those are the kinds of things, although it does transfer to some extent. But David Kessler worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he's just written a book called, I think it's called Finding Meaning, and he calls it the sixth stage. And it's really very powerful. So I do think that there's a lot of merit to what she did. I think she helped us to become more aware of what it means to die and how one can die more peacefully with some kind of acceptance. So yes, I think there's something to that. I also think, and I've done a lot of work with people who are dying, sitting at the bedside of people who are dying, and have had the privilege really of talking to them about what they're feeling, what they're thinking. And that too has been really sacred work. Privilege and a privilege.
For me, there are certain patients that just stick out in my mind of how their stories just changed my life forever. Do you have any specific people, any survivors or patients that stick out in your mind that just all really changed the course of your life?
I don't know that anyone in particular changed the course of my life, but there are some survivors with whom I had the closest of relationships. And one of them is still living. Eva is now 98 years old. She was a fabric artist in her career after the Holocaust. She is still creating, she is still painting. She is extremely creative and she's very deep. And we have these conversations that are so rich and wonderful. So she's one person who's really changed my life. But when I did the second volume of my book, I decided that what was really going to be important was to tell some of the survivors' stories, because I had always promised them that I would live and tell their story. And so I picked, there were so many. I worked with approximately 500 survivors throughout my years, but I picked those who really had an impact on me. Their stories really made a difference. They're stories that just stand out. Every survivor experience was so different. And so I also wanted to give the reader the opportunity to understand that not all survivors were in concentration camps. And there were a lot of children who were taken from their families and put in safe homes, and teenagers who were in the woods fighting the Nazis. So there's so many stories, and each one of them has tremendous value.
Yeah.
One story.
Go ahead.
One story of someone. His name was Louis Schneider, and his story just always stands out to me. Louis was put into a monastery, and there was an archbishop there. And periodically, if you can just picture the scene from Sound of Music, that's what happened. That the Nazis would actually come into these places and look for the Jews. So Louis was 7. And the archbishop heard that there was a Nazi coming. He put Louis in an apple cider barrel, and put the top on it, put something on top of that. So here's Louis, 7 years old, literally in this barrel with apple cider around him. And the Nazis came in and said, where are the Jews? And the archbishop said, there are no Jews here, and he left, and Louis came out. The second time the Nazis came, the archbishop didn't have time to hide Louis. So what he did was he took him and put him under his robes, because those days they had those huge robes. So Louis was under his robes, and the Nazi came in and said, where's the Jew? And the archbishop pointed to Jesus on the cross and said, the only Jew here is hanging on the wall.
Wow, that's powerful.
I know, that story just, oof. And when after the Holocaust, when he was freed, his parents actually were looking for each other, and they were on trains, and somehow they just coincidentally met on a train. I mean, the chances of that were amazing, and they were able to come and get Louis and his sister.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So you have now got 2 volumes of Living and Leaving My Legacy. Now, those are, you explain how you went about doing that, but these are all transcripts from your journals, right?
They're all excerpts from my journals, yes.
And
why I did it was because I had all these journals, and I wondered what to do with them. I wondered whether, in fact, I could leave them to my children, and realized early on that I really couldn't, that I write for myself, for my eyes only, that people have confided in me, and sometimes their stories are really powerful and I need to process them. And so I would write my journals, and I would never want to betray any of them. So I decided that I couldn't leave my journals to my children. But as an educator, I kept thinking to myself, I've got to have something in here. In all these pages, I have got to write something that's worthwhile to share with my children. So in the year 2002, I embarked on going through my journals and starting to read them and take excerpts. Originally, it was 40 topics. It grew to 70 topics. It took me 14 years to go through 300 at the time, 359 journals. And when I finished, then I had to decide what to do with it. And I realized that it was something that I thought there was enough that I thought was worth sharing with others. And so I decided to put the books out into the world. So I had to decide about topics, and I quickly eliminated many topics. I knew that I would have 11 topics in each book. But each topic had anywhere from 75 to 450 pages.
Wow.
And so it took me 5 more years to go through the 22 excerpts of 22 subjects and decide which excerpts to include. So it was a very long project.
So going through all of this, working with Holocaust survivors and children and everything, have you come up with any kind of pearls of wisdom on how to live lives, how to live your life? If you were talking to teenagers, what would you say?
Well, one of the things that I firmly believe is that how we live our life becomes our legacy. And if we want to be remembered in a certain way, then we need to be living that way. So pearls of wisdom for teenagers would be, one, to live in the moment, to make sure that you are focused in where you are, who you're talking to. Look at that person, understand that that life is fragile.
Mm-hmm.
Learn from people, be open to learning from your elders. So often teenagers kind of look at older people like they have no value, but to ask questions of your grandparents and your parents, find out, because so often people say to me, I only wish I had asked my mother or my father, my grandmother. So those are some things. Be kind, and understand that we only go through this life once. So we need to forgive others and forgive ourselves.
That's wonderful. For people who are interested in reading your magnificent books, Living and Leaving My Legacy, volumes 1 and 2, where can they get those books?
They are on sale on Amazon and anywhere that anyone buys books. And also my website, there's a link on my website that will take someone right.
And what is your website?
My website is Merle, MERLER Saferstein, SAFERSTEIN.com.
Thank you so much, Merle, for coming on this podcast. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Pamela, and I enjoyed talking to you too.
Okay, take care. Shana Tova.
Thank you, and to you.
What time will it be when war is no more? When bullets are melted and the warships moor.
This podcast is brought to you by Unbreakable Bindings Publishing Company. Executive produced by Lori Baldassi, produced by Ryan Richardson, hosted by Pam Goldstein.